What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some information on 15 new archetypes coming to Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous via its DLC, The Lord of Nothing, that is out on, I believe it's November 21st. And in addition to that DLC, they're also bringing substantial updates to the base game, though I'm unsure if these archetypes will be rolled into the base game or if they're specifically part of the DLC. So that's not information I have right now, but they have released information on what these archetypes are going to be, though with none of them actually in the game, you don't necessarily need to watch this video as I don't really have too much to show you, outside of a couple of screenshots here and there. And what's more, while some of these archetypes are officially released archetypes for Pathfinder 1e, some of them are homebrew and some of them have also been altered from the tabletop version, so I won't be able to go into specifics on exact numbers or anything like that. This is more of a general overview of what these new ones are going to be, and now let's dive into it. First up, we have a new hunter archetype called the Tandem Executioner. This one sees you combining forces with the hunter's normal pet that they get to perform unique battle tactics. And what's more, Alcat says the tactics available to this particular archetype will be unique to them, as opposed to several similar abilities that other archetypes might use in relation to tactics. I'll be honest, this is probably one of the ones I'm the least interested in. It just seems kind of okay, and there's a ton of pet-related archetypes and builds that you can already make, so this one doesn't speak to me personally. And they didn't give enough information on it otherwise. Now, our second entry, though, is a sorcerer archetype known as the Geomancer. This is a homebrewed one from Larian that is going to see a sorcerer with the ability to sacrifice some blood to enhance their spells based on the current terrain that you're in. So a couple things on this. It does say sacrifice your blood, which seems to me it's probably some sort of related HP cost to gain the benefits, and then the benefits themselves are based on the terrain you're in. If you're unfamiliar with the game, every map that you are on has an associated terrain for certain abilities for classes like the Ranger that have specific effects based on the terrain that they utilize, and it looks like this one is going to be able to utilize said terrain to enhance their spells to deal extra damage, weaken enemies, heal and protect allies even, so it certainly has some potential to be an interesting one. Third up, we have the Dual Cursed Oracle, an oracle that has to take 2 detrimental curses, and if it's like the tabletop version, one of those won't gain any associated benefits that the oracle would normally get from their first curse, as they would level up, though at the cost of that second curse, you get the ability to manipulate fate a little bit. In particular, and probably their, I would say, most noteworthy ability, is that they can force an enemy or an ally to re-roll something, and it looks like Owlcat has probably made this to affect critical success or failure in particular. That is to say, they can force an enemy to re-roll a critical success or a crit, and you can force an ally to re-roll a critical failure and turn it into a regular crit. They get a couple of other things, but that's probably the most noteworthy, and given that the Oracle is already a very strong class thanks to its powerful spellcasting, this is certainly an interesting prospect. Fourth up is a pretty exciting one with the Reanimator Alchemist. This particular alchemist is, unsurprisingly, a necromancer able to raise the dead and give corpses extra abilities. That is to say, you can give bonuses to the stats of the undead you raise as this class, which goes hand in hand with the Lich Mythic Path. As a mythic path that sees you doing nothing but raising the undead, the Reanimator sounds like it could buff the undead minions you summon even further beyond just what the Lich could do, and given that the Lich is already a crazy strong mythic path, this sounds like a really cool option for people. I would be surprised if this one doesn't get a lot of use, as buffing both your minions' stats and giving them additional attacks even could be a real game changer for an already powerful way to play the game. Now for our fifth entry, we have the Blood Rager archetype of Hag-Riven, which I always confuse and call Hag-Riven. The easiest way to describe this archetype would be, do you want to play Wolverine from X-Men? Because that's what this is. In addition to the Blood Rager's normal rage abilities and all the things that come with that, they're capable of growing magic claws and then turning them into indestructible magical weapons that deal even more damage. So again, if you want to play Wolverine, this is pretty much your chance to do so. That's what the Hag-Riven is all about. And then for our sixth one, we have the Dark Lurker Lurker Rogue. Now this is an interesting one because it is a Pathfinder 1E thing, but they've clearly had to make some adjustments to fit it into the game because there is no light mechanic. Normally the Dark Lurker is able to use your enemy's shadows to gain them bonuses to their chance to hit, and just making sure they're always hitting the enemy more or less, but Wrath of the Righteous doesn't really utilize the mechanics to make that work, so they've described it as adding those bonuses through a shadow cast by a large creature standing nearby, and you can kind of see on the screenshot, but I don't quite understand what they're trying to say here, as there's a few different ways that could be interpreted, but essentially the Dark Lurker is all about making attacks against targets that have concealment in particular, giving the Dark Lurker a very high chance to hit, and while that can certainly be beneficial, I think the exact quality of the archetype is going to depend on exactly how this was implemented, which I'm just not sure of yet. Now for number 7, we have an interesting one with a barbarian archetype known as the Flesheater, and as you might expect, this is an archetype where your barbarian eats the flesh of your fallen enemies. And in doing so, you can absorb some of their special abilities that will allow you to do things like restore health or just take on extra bonuses that, if my memory serves, the tabletop version has you taking on the specific bonuses from the beast shape spell just without actually polymorphing. But the interesting thing about this one is that in order to do that, you would normally take large penalties to your intelligence in particular. And I'm a little on the fence about this archetype because, as people may or may not know, in Pathfinder 1E, when your ability scores drop to 0, you die. And barbarians already aren't going to have a large intelligence stat, which is what this normally uses, so taking penalties to that intelligence stat makes you much more prone to ability damage from enemies that can lower it even further and potentially kill you outright. And I'd be very curious to know if they implemented this in a way that would allow you to stack bonuses until you accidentally cause your own character's imminent demise, which, while very funny, would definitely be frustrating for new people who didn't understand what was happening. So it's a pretty cool archetype, but I think there's a potential for that one to not be very good because that detriment to intelligence might be more serious than you might think. Now for number 8 though, we have a shaman archetype with the Prophet of Pestilience. An archetype that goes pretty perfectly with the Swarm That Walks mythic path, as this particular shaman binds their soul to one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, specifically Pestilence. In doing so, they gain a hex that is actually somewhat customizable in the sense that they can enhance it by weakening their victims, which goes hand in hand with some of the new spells this archetype gets, such as Living Plague, which allows them to summon swarms of insects that, upon defeating enemies, add more swarms to the battlefield. But all in all, this seems like a really cool one for a Swarm That Walks playthrough. Then we have our Paladin archetype, the Tortured Crusader. A fairly popular one, as it is ripe with roleplay potential, especially in the tabletop version, but it looks like this one's going to be pretty strong here as well, thanks to some reworks that Owlcat mentioned in their announcement that give this archetype bonus fighter feats as it levels up, alongside with bonuses as their allies fall in combat around them. And what's more, they're going to give the Tortured Crusader an ability to use Smite Evil on all enemies, regardless of things like their alignment, and while that was never a huge concern, in an adventure path where we're mostly fighting evil enemies anyway, there are some situations where that could be helpful. But then we have a really interesting archetype up next with the Separatist Cleric. Separatist Clerics are essentially a splinter group of the main religion centered around their deity. In fact, they might often be considered heretics, but the catch is these Separatists are actually still granted divine powers by said deity, so they still have their support. Now the catch to this archetype is that you're able to take a domain that your deity does not actually have, but the catch is it's not as strong as it would be otherwise. So for a slightly weaker version of a domain, you could get a domain that you wouldn't normally have access to. And what's more, they've actually added 2 domains with the Ice and Undead domains as well, which are thematically relevant to the upcoming DLC. So I'll be pretty interested to see what builds wind up coming from that one. Continuing on, however, we have our Druid archetype up next with the Winter Child. The Winter Child Druid gets access to a Blizzard Elemental for a companion instead of their typical pet that they might normally get, and as they level up, this Elemental is going to increase in power, and gain new abilities on top of buffs to your party as well. So instead of a pet or a companion, you'll have a blizzard following you around that gains in power as you level up and gains some unique abilities. Now the catch to this is it has to be a cold elemental, because it is a blizzard, of course. For number 12, we have the Ghost Rider Cavalier. A cavalier that instead of a normal mount uses a ghost horse. And seeing how cavaliers are already very strong, I think this will be a popular one, as the main benefit to using the Ghost Rider archetype is that you get to just outright ignore a lot of terrain effects, which means moving through like difficult terrain and the penalties you would take simply don't apply here. And what's more, I'm curious if they will also extend that to like damaging area of effects and what you may or may not take from that damage-wise. It'll be curious to see how that plays out. But at a bare minimum, Ghost Riders won't be subject to difficult terrain penalties. Now, for number 13, we have the one I'm personally the most excited about with the Weretouched Shifter, which builds off of the Shifter class added in the last Sarkorians DLC, giving it the Weretouched archetype, a very popular archetype for that class, though they have made a few changes to it here, so I'll have to see exactly how that pans out before I get too carried away. But the Shifter is already very strong, and the Weretouched version of a Shifter allows them to take their transformation a little bit farther and essentially become a were creature. And in this implementation, it looks like we're going to have access to 3 different forms, each of which has a associated playstyle and abilities that will improve as they level up. And it looks like those forms are rat, tiger, or wolf, I believe. In any event, I know this is one I will be taking a look at a lot personally, and when I get around to doing the story series, when they finally finish doing all this DLC, there's a not insignificant chance this will be the class that I do it with. But for number 14 on the list, we have our new wizard archetype, the Shadowcaster. This is a wizard that delves into the plane of shadow, of course, with one of their biggest abilities being the ability to prepare extra spells based on the highest level of spell they know. So as an example, if they know 9th level spells, they could prepare extra spells by getting extra spell slots that equal level 9 spells. So they could prepare an extra 6th and 3rd level spell slot or any combination, or say 9 level 1 spells for instance. And I'm curious how they're going to handle that from a UI perspective. But outside of those things, they naturally focus on the shadow evocation spells, illusion, things like that. They also get things like dark vision just naturally. And what's more, it looks like Owlcat has added the ability for them to transform into a shadow form as well, which isn't part of the tabletop version for this, which will give you some extra bonuses as well. So that brings us to our final new archetype with a witch archetype called the Hag of Gyronna. This one has also been reworked from its tabletop version, and it sounds pretty interesting. Basically at, I believe it's level 12, you'll be able to summon a night hag, and this hag, while it won't be able to access high-level spells, the spells it does know will be able to be cast an unlimited number of times, meaning they won't be subject to things like spell slots and the like. And as long as this hag doesn't count against your actual party limit, I think that might open up some really interesting ways to play the game that will be unique, if nothing else. And that, of course, also depends on the exact spells this hag has access to, and if that will just be like the witch's spell list up to that level or what. But this archetype definitely seems like it does something unique, and I'm interested in trying it out. But that is pretty much going to wrap it up for this quick overview of the archetypes coming from the new DLC. Again, I don't know if they'll be part of the base game or not. Overall, a lot of these sound really cool. A lot of them sound like they do things that aren't necessarily in the game already, and add a lot of unique mechanics in some way. And in combination with the DLC itself, and all the other changes they'll be making with the patch that drops alongside the game. For instance, blood kineticists are finally getting their actual blood animations instead of it just looking like water. That's another favorite archetype of mine. So it looks like there's a lot to look forward to with this DLC, and it is just right around the corner again, the 21st, and I'll definitely be covering it when it drops. So I hope you enjoyed the video, hope you're looking forward to all the changes coming, and if you are, let me know how you feel about them down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.